Well, thanks for joining me all the way from across the pond again. We get together. So the British invasion is here in Houston. Thank you, Elliot, Nadine. The session this morning, I wanted to talk about what everybody's talking about, the digitalization of healthcare and medtech and health tech across. So the appropriate place to start would be, we're throwing the word digitalization around really liberally. How do you define it from a Proximie and a market perspective?
I think what's really important is to recognize that, digital itself isn't the solution. It's how you weave in digital into changing workflow, changing practices. We've recognized, and as a practicing clinician myself, there's a huge challenge around how we scale expertise, how we provide care to every patient no matter where they are, and how do we just accelerate the delivery of care across huge health systems and huge geographies. That is compounded by, workforce challenges, staffing challenges, accessibility. And so by bringing in digital, you're able to augment and bring in an ability to really change the way we do care, move away from bricks and mortar, move away from in-person to thinking about where and when is it the right place to weave in digital, and how can that really help us augment and force multiply the expertise that we can have or the care that we can deliver to people, all around the world. And in our experience at Proximie, where digital has been essential is really thinking about the operating room and surgery. Because for far too long, that environment has been analog. It's probably that kind of like last bastion of healthcare that has really retained its analogness, if there's such a word. And if you think about that operating room, you walk in, everything is disconnected. There are claims that things are digital or data-driven, but they're in silos. And so I guess our definition of digital and data-driven is really kind of connecting the dots, crowdsourcing and creating one vehicle, one operating system that enables you to bring all the key components of healthcare, clinical expertise, human expertise, information from data, devices, people, processes, and make that really an ability to really scale expertise.
Do you think we're ready to process all that data? I mean, that's a massive amount of knowledge, mind share, and so where do we put it? How do we access it? When do we access it? And I think we have this dream of Valhalla on digital, but I'm just curious how we're going to now parse all that out and extract the value. So on digital, from your perspective and Inovus's perspective, what do you look at?
Yeah, I think before I come back and answer that, I'm actually going to put something in that makes it even harder to think about how we capture that and where do we store it and all those things. And that's this piece, which is Nadine and Proximie are primarily at the moment solving things in the theatre, so interoperatively. And we were talking about this yesterday, weren't we, which is actually when we think about digitalization of surgery, it's not just the piece that's in theatre, it's that preoperative piece, which is primarily where we sit as Inovus. So we're able to capture lots and lots of data on how well surgeons are performing in a simulated surgical environment. And then there's the postoperative piece as well, and there's all that data sitting in the pre and the postoperative world. So it comes back to your question, which is, well, actually, if we are capturing all that data, what are we going to do with that so that it has value to the patients? Because that's the whole point of what we're doing here. And I think one of the most important things is we're looking at building systems and technology that has interoperability. Because there's no point in having siloed data from the Inovus platforms, completely siloed from the Proximie platforms, siloed from the Avail platforms. That's not going to make any sense. It doesn't help anyone. We need huge amounts of data to come together. Then over to your question, how do we store that? I honestly don't know the answer to that yet. It's going to be a major undertaking, but I think really the first step is getting these platform providers speaking to each other and making sure that technology is built in a way that it can work together.
Health tech, med tech is a relatively evidence-based industry, whether it's medical evidence, whether it's financial evidence, and that's how institutions, clinicians make their decisions. But in order to gather evidence, you need time. You need time, you need procedures, you need experiences. And then you need to tag those. And you need to assign a value or an intelligence to those. And then you have to be patient enough to let those come out. We call those clinical trials when we're making a device or a diagnostic. But both of you sit outside of a 510K or a PMA. And both of you sit in an area of who's going to pay for this. So if I don't have a body of work on evidence, and I don't have a clinical trial with a start and an end and a validation of evidence is good, what kind of patience do you have to have, Nadine? And does the market have to adopt in order for us to get the telehealth, the digital training over the line?
I think it's a great question. And first of all, I would say is, interestingly, over decades, there's been quite a body of evidence around the use of digital in healthcare. It's in different pockets of it, but if you actually take a step back and look at that evidence, there is evidence that sits out there. For example, the use of video for surgery, or connectivity, or telepresence, solutions. So there have been bodies of evidence, but it's the execution of it that has always been very challenging. There's researchers, scientists that know that this can make a difference, value-based economic models that demonstrate that this can make a difference, but it's the execution of how you make it happen that is often challenging. But that being said, I think the key bit that's really important is two bits. One is there has to be an immediate touch point where it's creating immediate value, so that clinical teams and others are feeling excited and interested in adopting and being willing to transform how they do things in a way that's quite different, that's quite disruptive. Even if it doesn't mean that there's a huge body of evidence immediately there, but an immediate intuition that I can see how this is going to change my practice or get better care to patients, is that initial hook that gets them hooked into. And if they feel that that is reaping some benefits, they'll stick it out for the longer run of evidence. I think what's also interesting is that when we look at the trial space in general, you're starting to see a bit of a shift away from your traditional RCTs, those long, lengthy, arduous type of trials, to more adaptive trials or more kind of case study type trials. Enough evidence that proves to us that there's meaning and value. And then rather than spending a lot of time hypothetically trying to assess it, put it in clinical practice or put it in real world environments and start to see how it's adapting and how it's shifting within those real world levers. We're seeing it even in kind of proper clinical trials in pharma. They're immediately shifting, how do we put this in real world? How do we understand what it's like in a real sense? And so I think with digital it'll be the same. With our experience at Proximie, I had a vision of us really becoming that OS of connected surgical care, and to Elliot's point, pre, intra, and post-op. But I needed that initial wedge, that hook, where I could immediately provide value for people, where they'd be interested and excited about having these kinds of solutions in their operating rooms. And for us, telepresence and collaboration was an immediate value. Immediately you could use it one day and see, hold on a minute, I don't have to travel, a day to go somewhere to work with someone. I could do this in an hour. And over time, though, as we're starting to aggregate video data, surgical data, we'll be able to have and be a bit more patient to have the long-term benefits or the long-term value-based ROIs that we hope to continue to demonstrate. But it's not easy. I think anyone who sort of claims it's easy, I think hasn't done it. But I think we're seeing shifts that are multidimensional. The model of trials is changing. A hook to early adoption is important. And then how we measure ROI can adapt over time in a real world sense.
Your thoughts on that, Ellie?
Yeah, I think Nadine touched on that point about execution. We talk heavily at Inovus about inventive execution. So how are we going to do something that brings intrinsic value to the end user? So the way we look at it, again, we sit primarily in that preoperative surgical simulation space. We try to make sure we're creating technologies that have immediate intrinsic value, where we take it into someone and we say, this is what our technology does. This is how it solves the problem for you in a more affordable, more accessible, and more scalable way. And because we know that has intrinsic value, people are willing to hand over their dollars for that technology. And when we're then talking about the digitalization piece, the inventive execution is then, well, okay, you're handing your dollars over for this piece of technology here which solves this part of the continuum. Is there a way in which we can take our technology and expand that through the continuum, either through collaboration or integration with other platforms, or just using our own platform to say, well, you're already using that in this piece here. So again, take the example of Inovus, preoperative surgical simulation. You've bought a load of simulators from us. There's a digital training platform that's associated with that. But now you've got that digital platform and you're using it in the preoperative space. What happens if we extend that into theatre for you? And there's no extra capital cost, there's no extra other cost because you've already purchased this from us. And that inventive execution, I think, is the way that not just Inovus and Proximie need to be thinking, but the bigger players need to be thinking as well, because to your question, who is paying for this? Where is the value to the people that are paying for it? And I think if you can show, here's intrinsic value, you've already got it, now you can leverage the investment you've already made to add further value to what you're doing, because we all know that you want this. I think that's a really important way of tackling this.
Well, that's some of the argument and the legitimate argument about leveraging digital, right? It's a scalable entity once you get it in the ecosystem. So Nadine, when you get it in Stryker's hands, or you get it into one of the network hospitals' hands. You say, okay, we're going to put it in this use case today, and then we want to get a land and expand mentality as we go ahead and commercialize this and continue to add value. And I just need to, not that simple, but just keep opening up the faucet for more value to you, and then therefore more value to the patient, more value to evidence-based arguments downrange. But, there's always a but, how do we get people to understand that? You know, you both are trying to overcome the momentum of analog, in-person service provision. Each one teach one, watch my hands, watch my eyes, watch what I do. Same with you, right? You're teleporting people, you're simulating. So what has been the biggest struggle, I'll start with you, Elliot, in that environment? We've had training, so to speak, but you at Inovus have taken it to a different level. So it's an AR, it's a simulation, it's not an analog function on a rubber dummy sitting on a table.
Yeah, I think there's a real clear sort of pinch point here, which is we've got this antiquated approach to surgical training, and that's through the whole continuum. You've touched on it there. See one, do one, teach one, with the early learning curve at the patient bedside. To myself and Nadine, who are both clinicians, we look at that and go, that is absolutely astonishing that we're still doing that as the mainstay of training our surgeons, with early learning curve at the patient bedside. There needs to be later learning curve at the patient bedside, but not the early learning curve. And then the question is, well, why is that still happening? And you look at the technologies that are incumbents that have come along, and they've taken a technology and they've gone, this is a cool technology, let's apply it to this problem over here. And that means that the technology is too costly. It's not accessible enough and therefore not scalable enough, because it comes back to this issue of, if we want to move the early learning curve away from the patient bedside into a simulated environment, and that means that the later learning curve is taken over by the likes of Proximie, you have to make sure that there is enough scale for the surgeons to do their training in a simulated environment. And you can't do that if things are too expensive. And then the final thing is, if we're going to move away from the patient bedside, we need to make sure that that learning is incredibly realistic, because otherwise we're trying to substitute something that we know has worked for generations of surgeons. And that comes, again, back to the previous technologies using virtual to create haptics and all these things. So we look at it in that way. Let's make the technology more affordable, let's make it more accessible, let's make it more realistic. But it always comes back to this question of then, because this has been a nice to have, because the gold standard has always been, let's learn in theatre, where are the purchasing pathways for that? And that's something that's now maturing. And actually I think it's down to industry to say, guys, here is something with enough intrinsic value, with the value add coming down the ecosystem, that we can see pathways starting to mature for that technology.
So that's interesting, as you took me down that pathway, both of you have a product that it's really easy for the market to say, yeah, we see that. Zoom and an analog rubber model with, you know, an Arthrex setup, whatever it is. And like, yeah, we got that. But it's different. Yeah, it's digital. And then they walk away. And they really don't understand the depth of impact that, and the compounding effect this has across sort of the bounds of healthcare. How are you managing through that, Nadine?
I mean, I think what's important is, first of all, you know, to the point about the product itself, I think, you know, once people actually look at take a look at the product itself, they recognize that there's quite a difference between a Zoom or a rubber model versus a Proximie or Inovus. I mean, it's designed by doctors for doctors. It's got a multidimensional approach, and it's also designed to be future-proof. Because the challenge is, a lot of what you described could be a point solution for a moment in time. They could solve something now, but could be, you know, out of date 5 years from now. We all trained on those rubber models that are kind of out of date at the moment. That's not, you know, it's the fidelity's low, the experience is not great. They're not designed for that environment. What we see with Inovus and Proximie, I believe, is these are platforms that are designed to be future-proof, to continue to evolve, and continue to extend beyond the initial kind of wedge use case. You know, you described that immediate training, we described that immediate telepresence, but we continue to evolve it. Media management, asset tracking, you know, instrumentation, video management, content, creator environments. All of those are coming through one door. And then you start to link into components like Inovus, components post-op. That is not going to be something that a rubber model could do or a Zoom could do, because they're not designed for that complexity of an environment. And as we know, healthcare is incredibly complex. Lots of stakeholders. You're trying to address multiple stakeholders through a single product line, and taking and coming through it with a suite of solutions through one platform is really going to be the way that you solve it, because we're all tired of cluttered point solutions. There are a dime a dozen out in the market. There's a lot of them, but they're all disconnected. They're all siloed, and they only solve one piece that's not future-proofing it for later. And I think to address a bit the point you were making earlier that I think Elliot was answering is, it's also about how do you accelerate the trained clinician to treat patients. We are in a huge backlog of care. The supply-demand mismatch has never been so big. We are unable to keep up with the demand of patients that need great quality care, and we don't have 10 years to train a surgeon. We have to think differently. We have to think, how can I take that training time down to 2 years, 3 years, and how can I make sure that the quality is still there, the safety is still there, and the effectiveness is still there. And so I see solutions like Inovus, Proximie, and others are going to be that kind of linchpin that's going to help us traverse this really difficult challenge that we're at now, and hopefully enable us to deliver care at scale for everyone who needs it.
You just mentioned something there that got my brain thinking on two levels. One is it takes 10 years to train a surgeon. No, it takes X repetitions to train the surgeon. And so if I can accelerate that repetition through technology in both of your cases, and I see an overlay here on, again, this wasn't a construct, is, okay, you get them in the early days, and you get that blocking and tackling down, right? And then, Nadine, then I can get you bedside, and those things continue, and it's not a handoff, it's an overlay.
It's a collaboration. We call it prepare, perform, perfect. It's really about how you're preparing, and that preparing could be using an Inovus system, could be watching some videos on the platform. Then you're ready to go to bedside, as you described, we're ready to perform. How do you make sure that you're doing that? But it could be linking back to what your sim training was, to sort of connect the data and say, this is how you did in real time, this is how you were doing on your training. And then how do you perfect? It might tell you, look, here's a gap, you really need to go back on the simulator for this. Or, I've watched your video, this is the bit where you did really, really well, I would continue to do that, but and that can be eventually done, sort of autonomously. It doesn't have to then be, systems, telling you that. And I think that is where we want to see that continue, where, rather than industry all trying to do it themselves, is come together. And I've been banging on about it all weekend, really. It's like collaboration is key, because it's the way I think. And on the point of repetition, I think you're spot on. I mean, I trained in London, but there was incredible cases happening all up and down the country. Incredible, world firsts, first hand transplant, first this, first that. I didn't get to see it. But if you had a system like a Proximie where you're able to crowdsource experiences from anywhere, and so you can see those 100 cases, 1,000 cases, 5,000 cases in a much shorter period of time, get your pattern recognition, get your case understanding, decision-making moving faster, that's when you can really accelerate the time to sort of train doctors, combined with solutions like Inovus.
This is one of the exciting privileges that I have, is when I sit with entrepreneurs all the time. And I will tell you, there's a marked difference when I sit with an entrepreneur who's making a heart valve, and then I sit with entrepreneurs who are creating a digital platform. The open architecture, the obsession with a permeability in their product, and a collaboration in their product, a partnering intention, that is the difference that I get to see as I sit and I watch. Okay, I'm so myopically focused on solving a single problem in a moment in time versus the future-proofing and the leveraging of expertise across channels. So, final question for both of you. In the US, healthcare costs us about 18% of our GDP. Might be more over the last 2 years, but let's keep it at 18% today. And invariably, most people focus on the intraoperative and or the diagnostic side of things. How do we reduce costs there? And yesterday, somebody had a slide up that they were talking about Moore's Law, is every 2 years, we can cut in half and accelerate volume in regards to capabilities. But in medtech, it's actually the inverse of that. It becomes more and more expensive to do a procedure and design a device. I don't think we're going to affect that 18% GDP intraoperatively and or diagnostically. It's going to come from the fringes right now. Both of you are building businesses on the fringes. And I don't mean that that's where the crumbs are. I think that's where the massive opportunities are. How are you finding yourself up against those windmills of the legacy mindset of healthcare? whether you're selling into a hospital, whether you're selling into a clinician, or into a strategic, as some of your customers are.
Yeah, I'll pick that up. It's some great points here, and the inverse law. When you actually look at what Proximie and Inovus are doing, we are then flipping that back on its head, because this inverse law is effectively, that slide was saying the cost of medtech doubles. And what we're saying is actually, let's take technologies and think about it in a completely contrarian way, inventive execution, and let's make the cost of our platforms considerably less. But the result of that is, because they're now considerably less, we can put them in the hands of 10, 100, 1,000x more people. So all of a sudden, when you look at that, you go, okay, if you take that approach, yes, in the first instance, you may be selling something for less than your competitor, but the scale that we can go to then allows us to start having the impact back into this 18% of cost. And what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, we presented some data yesterday that shows that training on our platform will reduce time to operate by 41%. So it's very easy to understand the metrics and the cost of, well, this is how long it takes and this is how much it costs to keep a theatre open. And here is the time that we can reduce in theatre to do this particular procedure. Here's your cost saving. And by the way, you're able to achieve that cost saving because you can put our technology in the hands of everyone, and therefore everyone is able to reduce their time in theatre, not just one or two surgeons that have got the luxury of access to the technology. So this point on how do we reduce cost and how do we affect these current models of healthcare, you've just got to think in a contrarian approach, and ultimately I think that will be the thing that drives it for us.
And the contrarian approach is the common sense approach.
Keep it simple, stupid. It's,
so have we gone to a bit of insanity in our approach? In other words, I'm inferring that you're not, because I don't need customers, but contrarian is common sense right now. What you're both describing is common sense.
It is, and it kind of, once they see, they're like, oh, but this is obvious, and kind of, I'll just add on to what Elliot's saying, but everything's spot on, you come in from the edges and you actually show them a different way of doing things, and suddenly like, hold on a minute, so using Proximie, I can do our hospital can do a month's worth of operating in a day. Yes, you can. That's a month's worth of operating. I mean, the impact that has on a hospital, both from patient benefit, access, financial as well, efficiency, effectiveness, but also team morale, because the team thinks, gosh, we've been able to touch so many more lives in that one day that we were, that we would have otherwise, only done a fraction of. So suddenly you're able to create a critical mass, a land grab. You go in, there's enough people that are starting to adopt the solution and seeing it. It initially comes in as a left field type product. They're like, well, this is interesting, we'll have a go. And suddenly they're like, how do we make this mainstream? And we saw this in our hospital. We started off with a couple of interested surgeons who were using it, and it just grew and grew and grew. Every specialty, every surgeon, suddenly they're like, every OR should have this. Now you've got the anesthesiologist saying, we need to run our list this way. And you make that shift, but you got to go in, you got to show them that initial value, because they see you as a left field, contrarian, or kind of like fringes type product. But the minute you're in, like, this is so obvious, the value is huge. But you have to hit that critical mass, and it's not easy. Early on, you are seen as a peripheral product, but as soon as you come in and it gets into their hands, it's like, oh my God, this is so obvious.
I think, I just want to put one other point in. This has already happened in other industries. IBM was sitting there going, we're just putting these massive supercomputers into these office blocks and big buildings. And then the personal computing revolution came along, and there was teething issues. It was difficult for them to break through. And now look, in my pocket, I have a phone that is more powerful than those IBM mainframe computers were. Yes, the technology has moved on. But I think when people ask us, what are you doing at Inovus, and in terms of your approach to the market, and I always liken this to Proximie as well, we are driving that revolution that happened in computing, but we're doing it in medtech.
I always feel like I'm coming home when I chat with you two, because we had the same thing 7 years ago, when we created digital recruiting by putting out content and getting courageous entrepreneurs who are creating a product and then telling their story at scale and reaching hundreds of thousands of people with our messaging a day, versus picking up a telephone, one conversation, one point of influence, hang it up, do it again. And now the industry's moved towards that. So whenever we chat, it's always like I'm coming home here. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for taking time out today. I'm Joe Mullings from Houston, SDTS. Be well.